Spirits are one of those archetypes that has support, but a lot of that support does not do anything to help manage its weaknesses, thereby making its value questionable. Therefore, building a spirit deck that has any chance to compete can be tricky and difficult. So, what type of spirit deck do I run to try to compete? This deck proceeds like most, looking at the direct support first. Note that I'm going to skip the archetype-specific spirit monsters like the Gichkis and the like. Starting off, Hino Kagusuchi is a nice card, but its problem is that in the modern environment, it's such that taking advantage of its hand-destroying effect can be tricky due to most players playing a large number of cards early and then having defenses against effects like this while they continue to achieve resources. Basically, those are the two problems with this effect. Opponents typically do not have large hands to dump, so there's less of a bang from Hino's attack, and there's frequently a large number of back row to have to navigate through to get Hino's attack to land in the first place. Overall, in my opinion, the effect is too inconsistent in the modern game to really warrant running this card, and that 2 tribute cost also hurts, despite a card like Nikitama. Yamato Dragon has kind of the opposite problem as Hino, as Hino's effect is hit or miss due to your opponent's playstyle, because typically they're not going to have large hands when even it is possible to summon the card. Yamato suffers from the player's hand size being large most of the time due to the return aspect for spirit monsters. Overall, Yamato is actually a nice tech card in appropriately designed swarming decks. I mean, I'm surprised people haven't tried to dump a Yamato into something like a Performa Mage deck, but it doesn't seem to work very well in a pure spirit deck. In short, Yamato is difficult to run efficiently because spirit monsters return to your hand, thus you're constantly restoring and restocking your hand, heavily limiting any advantage you might gain from the effect. Also, the inability to special summon a vast majority of spirit monsters hurts the viability of its effect. Dark Dust Spirit, however, is a very nice spirit monster that actually I feel is rather usable. Controlled field clearance is always nice, and in combination with Nikitama, as the tribute, this card also nets you a draw, in addition to destroying all face-up monsters on the field other than itself. The only real question I have with Dark Dust Spirit is, do you run 1 or 2? Running 2 is a safety valve just in case one gets hit with a monster effect negator and later sent to the graveyard, or it just gets banished. But running 2 also has the potential to produce bad draws, for 1 typically is enough to get the job done due to the return effect. In my experience, I find only running 1 to be sufficient, because there's other means to get spirits back into your hand from the graveyard. And usually using those safety valves limits the negatives of running it. Dust Spirit at 1. Yamato-no-Kami is another nice spirit monster with an innate special summons effect that makes its summons easy and produces opportunities to swarm. While the 2200 attack is a little lacking, the special summons effect increases monster destruction efficiency because it allows you to pick and choose when you summon it, thus increasing its ability to destroy back row. Yamato-no-Kami also supports the draw effect associated with Nikitama, especially when Nikitama is XZ material. You special summon Yamato-no-Kami, detach Nikitama, get your draw. I only run 2 copies though because it is searchable, and 3 copies can get a little cloggy, especially early, for spirit monsters going to the graveyard is not as straightforward as it is for monsters in other decks. Oh boy, it's pronunciation time. Let's see if I screw this up. Fang Hung, I think that's right, probably not, is the counter monster to Dark Dust Spirit in that it destroys all set back row for the opponent. The problem with this card is a lot of back row in the current meta is chainable, thus it limits the effectiveness of the card. Also, its inability to destroy pendulum cards further hurts its playability. I try to avoid it, focus on using standard back row removal instead. Great Longnose is kind of like Yamato Dragon in a sense. It's a very nice card when you build a specific type of deck around it, where it's the centerpiece card, but that strategy really doesn't fit for this particular deck design, so I stay away from it. Souza Soldier is not a bad card, for it is a 2000 attack point hitter. The problem is that there's no real place for it in this deck due to both space limitations, and that's all it really is a 2000 attack point hitter. It doesn't have a strong effect, and it doesn't really combo with anything, so it's kind of just a stray monster in your deck that has 2000 attack points that returns to your hand. I mean, the drawback of half damage is somewhat irrelevant because the real job of a card like Souza Soldier is to kill monsters, not really attack directly. Yaksha is a nice card with 1900 attack points and a single target spell trap bounce. However, kind of similar to Souza, it's really just not good enough in my opinion for the deck. The bounce is somewhat irrelevant. Once again, we find another spirit monster where I'm not really good in a spirit deck, but I'm a really nice tech card in another deck. Let's introduce Ashura Priest. Again, great tech card in specific decks designed almost around it. Not a very good card that helps the standard build because 1700 is decent, but you're typically not going to run over multiple monsters with just 1700. So I'd leave Ashura Priest on the cutting room floor for the pure, kind of more pure spirit build. Rasetsu is definitely worth a spot in this deck, for it has the almost always useful monster bounce ability to help clear the field of monsters. Unfortunately, the use of the effect must be somewhat strategic because when it is used, you cannot special summon on the same turn. Fortunately, this is typically not that big of a deal for spirit decks. Also, an unfortunate restriction is that Rasetsu cannot show an in-hand copy of itself to activate its effect, thus it can get a little cloggy if you run it at 3, so I only run 2. But I do understand this restriction because the idea that, well, we don't want people just splashing this very effective bounce technique into just the random decks. We want to make sure that this card just stays in principally spirit decks, which I definitely respect. Moving on, Maharagari is a okay card, but its chief problem is it's too slow and it's too weak. The ability to only look at one card during the next draw phase just doesn't get it done in my opinion. If this card were 19, 2000 attacker, then it might be worth a look because now it can kill stuff as well as get you that potentially important piece of information about what comes next in your deck. But again, with its current attack, it's just too weak because that information ability isn't that valuable. Fushi no Tori is just too weak, and the life point gain in a spirit deck, that just doesn't serve much purpose. I mean, clearly the idea behind this card is obvious. You're going to have clear field, you're going to take damage, so you want to get some of that damage back with this card, but it's just poorly executed because, again, it's a spirit and it's too weak. 1200 back, even if you attack directly, is just nothing. It was basically nothing then, and it's nothing now. Is not a great card, but it definitely has its uses. Most spirit decks do not have a good means to feed the graveyard. Izanami can accomplish that task, as well as work with Nikitama to gain an extra draw, help summon Yamato-no-Kami, or retrieve a potentially useful card for the next turn. However, outside of this effect, Izanami is rather bad. It's unable to actually kill almost anything, thus I only run one copy because it can be searched for, so you don't want to be drawing into this card voluntarily. Tsukiyomi basically earns really just its fame for being a effective and crucial tech during the flip effect stall era rather than being a useful card in an actual spirit deck. Gundari's effect is just too specific and far too inconsistent. Just skip it. There's no reason to run this card. Aratama is one of the most important monsters in this deck, for it is your Stratos. Aratama's effect creates strong efficiency during deck design because now you can run one copy monsters and they can actually play a legitimate role in the duel. Running 3 copies is pretty much a no-brainer. Nikitama is another one of the important monsters in the deck, for it provides incredibly important second summons, which make single tribute spirit monsters much more effective. Unfortunately, there aren't very many of those, as well as providing nice XZ or synchro play opportunities. The draw effect is also quite useful, for it is not too difficult to achieve. Some examples of its activation are when you tribute summon Dark Dust Spirit using Nikitama as the tribute, when Izanami sends it to the graveyard from the hand for its effect, and when it's detached from an XZ when a spirit is on the field. Of course, that last one immediately laments the fact that, there's no XZ monster that's a spirit, but I'm not really sure how that design would go either. That would be kind of interesting, though, to see if a spirit XZ ever came into an existence. Finally, none of the other 3 legal spirit monsters are worth the discussions, because none of them really are very good, so we'll skip them. Also, I feel there's little reason to discuss any of the spirit spell trap support, because again, it's just not very good. The only card that may even be worth it would be Spirit's Invitation, but the problem with this card is that your opponent really shouldn't have any monsters on the field when a spirit monster is returned to your hand due to its effect, because you should have gotten rid of them earlier in the turn, or you should be setting your spirits for defensive purposes. So the card at its best is inefficient, and at its worst is rather worthless. For the rest of the monsters, I like augmenting my XZ play potential with synchro potential. Thus, I run 3 copies of TG Striker, for it can special summon itself, making synchro plays rather easy. The one unfortunate thing about Striker in this deck is that most of the spirit monsters are level 4, and the level 6 synchro family is probably, when it comes to the big families, 5, 6, 7, 8, the level 6 family is probably the worst of the group. Fortunately, in combination with Nikitama and its second normal summons, you can make Leo rather easily. With a clear field, it is important to have a means to stop your opponent from making big plays. Therefore, you can either run, in my opinion, the 2 copies of Battle Fader or 2 copies of Effect Veiler. I prefer Effect Veiler to help reduce damage that my opponent can inflict due to massive monster effect laden combinations they could string together. Finally, because it's easier to deal with that than, okay, you pulled your big combination together, I'm going to block this one attack with Fader, but now somehow I have to deal with the threats you've just put on the field. I'd rather just negate the threats, take the 1700 damage direct, and then start fresh for my turn, rather than face down like 2 special summoned monsters off 1 monster effect. Finally, with 5 light monsters, 5 dark monsters in this deck, it certainly makes sense to run 1 Blackluster Soldier, Envoy at the beginning, and this deck really does need the firepower that he brings. For the spells in this deck, I run the fewest copies of my staples for any of my decks. I only run 1 Raigeki, 1 Book of Moon. The lack of Soul Charge is obvious because you really can't special summon spirits, and Dark Holes can be a little too slow when your opponent will have the clear field a good percentage of the time. Not surprisingly, speed for this deck is critically important. It's critically important for pretty much all decks, but especially this one, so I run 3 copies of Upstart Goblin, as well as 3 copies of Pot of Duality. The no special summon, as expected, is really not a significant obstacle for this deck, because most of the time when you use it, you typically don't have the resources required to make some big special summons play. Also, I run 3 copies of Creature Swap. Creature Swap in Spirit decks is rather brutal because with a little patience, you get your opponent's monster for the cost of activating Creature Swap and not doing anything excessive on your battle phase. It's basically like a permanent change of heart. Creature Swap is also nice because if you swap Nikitama while you have another spirit monster on the field, which you should because of Nikitama's second normal summons effect, you can run over the Nikitama with the monster you just got from the Creature Swap, and you get a draw. Finally, I run 2 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon for standard field clearance, especially for those Fiendish Chains and breakthrough skills, for monster effect negators can really hurt this deck. For the traps, I run the 3 most important staples, in my opinion: 1 Torrential, 1 Bottomless, one Solemn Warning. With creature swaps in this deck, I think running 3 copies of Legacy of Yata-Garasu is also nice for worst case scenario. It's basically just a slightly slower version of Upstart Goblin that can possibly bait out an opponent's back row destruction. And best case scenario is a Pot of Greed. Now, what card can both help the monsterless field and potentially get the opponent to swing and miss at a legacy? The choice, I think, is fairly straightforward. It's the oldie, but still a goodie, despite the fact that it gets ragged on by a lot of people, Mirror Force. Mirror Force helps protect your open field, and even though it's not chainable, there is enough chainable back row in this deck, and there is enough other things to bluff with, that it can give your opponent some serious pause when trying to guess which of those 3 or 4 back row you have face down is the Mirror Force. 3 copies works nicely at really annoying your opponent and saving your bacon. Some might wonder about the lack of 2 specific cards. Where's the Vanity's Emptiness? Where's the Lose One Turn? I don't run Vanity's Emptiness in this deck because often it's not really a good card, because spirit monsters do not maintain quality field control, thus it's difficult for them to get back in the game sometimes without having that ability to special summon that XZ play off Nikitama, or special summon that Yamato-no-Kami, or even special summon the BLS. So, because your guys bounce back to your hand, there's less probability that the vanities will be destroyed. Your opponent typically can outpace and outdamage spirit decks, almost regardless of what deck they're running, in a 1-to-1 situation. So the Vanities more restricts your ability to make that big important comeback play than your opponent's ability to crush you. Also, because of the lack of field presence in this deck, using Vanities is kind of a simple 1-to-1 to stop a special summons by the opponent isn't as useful as it is for other decks, because you have less ability to take advantage of that stoppage. The lack of the lose one turn is kind of based on the similar principle. The inability of spirits to hold the field with normal summons hurts the viability and efficiency of lose one turn in this deck. Also, there's an issue with deck space. For if I want to play lose one turn, something will have to be taken out, and in my opinion, the 2 most obvious choices would be the Mirror Forces, but I think the Mirror Forces work much more effectively than lose one turn. And I could replace the legacies, but I've done that in the past and it just didn't work out very well for me. The draw power of the legacies helped better than the occasional ability of lose one turn to shut down the special summon monster for 1 turn. I don't know, maybe you could say it was bad luck over and over again, but the lose 1 turn does not seem to help the deck very much in my experience. For the extra deck, the synchro monsters are kind of a mixed bag, with level 10, level 8, and level 6 all being reasonable, and level 7 being possible but not very likely, so realistically just choose your favorites. For me, I run 2 copies of Leo, Keeper of the Sacred Tree, because with Nikitama and TG Striker, it's rather easy to get Leo on the field. I run 1 Hot Red Archfiend Dragon to supplement Dark Dust Spirit and its removal. I run 1 Thought Ruler Archfiend. Spirit decks have trouble slugging it out, so high value life gain is definitely worth it. I run 1 Goyo Guardian. I run 1 copy of Red Wyvern. It's a great new level 6 synchro, which has a nasty quick play destruction effect, almost forcing the opponent to destroy it via card effect. For the XZ monsters, I run 1 Consteller Ptolemy M7 and 1 Photon Strike Bounzer. Both can be made with your 2 copies of Yamato-no-Kami. I run the 4 rank 4s, Exciton Knight, number 101, Castel, XZ Dragon. I also run the twin Gagagas, 1 Gagaga Samurai, 1 Gagaga Cowboy. And finally, because spirits tend not to use the graveyard as much as almost every other deck, 1 Abyss Dweller. Overall, a spirit deck is an interesting challenge because it has those bright spot cards that build a strong base for a good deck, but one typically has to look elsewhere to fill in the rest of the pieces. While this deck is certainly not highly competitive, I actually have a lot of fun playing it, in part because it's not a paint-by-numbers deck where you're basically doing the same thing every time, every duel in order to win. That variety gives it a lot of enjoyment. Well, that's my Spirit deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.